So in today's lecture, I want to offer a couple of thoughts that draw on my work that I did in Our Common Bonds, but I've continued with a number of organizations that work to bridge divides among Democrats and Republicans in the mass public. So while these divides are, these observations are drawn from studies of overcoming partisan animosity, I think they equally apply to overcoming other types of division. So with that in mind, I'd like to offer 3 pieces of advice, and hopefully we'll keep it to not too much more than 60 seconds. The first one is that listening is more important than talking. Now that probably sounds a bit trivial, but I think there's something deeper there. And the deeper thing is this, that we often think we know what other people are going to say, but we often don't listen very carefully to what other people do. So the deepest lesson I learned from participating in, structuring, and observing several hundred of these conversations was that the learning actually takes place when you pay careful attention to what the other person or other people in the conversation are saying. All right, so how do you do that then? There's a lot of different ways. Let me give you just 2 different strategies you can use to help you listen more effectively. The first one is what I like to say is to listen to understand someone's perspective. Now, if any of you know anything about the literature in social psychology or political science, this often gets called perspective taking, right? So you try to imagine someone else's perspective. But I actually think a better name for it is perspective getting, because what you're doing is you're learning someone else's perspective. Because we often think that those who disagree with us have their opinions because they don't know what I know. They're just prejudiced. They haven't read the right things. But if you actually listen to them and take the time to try and understand their point of view, not always, but often you might find yourself saying, I'd never thought of it that way. Or, oh, I hadn't considered that. Or, gee, it hadn't occurred to me how someone with those life experiences might come to that point of view. So even if you don't care so much about understanding at a deep level, what I often tell people is that you should care about this if you ever want to persuade someone, because everything we know from how to persuade people says that you have to understand them if you ever want to have any chance at persuading them. The second type of listening to do is listening to show people that you're carefully paying attention. This often is called empathic listening. And so if you listen carefully to people and then repeat back to them some of what they're saying, it signals to them, right, that I'm not just listening to you in a glib or superficial way, but I'm really hearing what it is that you have to say. And one of the things that I've really found with doing this, especially when you move beyond students to the kind of broader community, is that one thing people really want, especially those who come from communities who are often not listened to, is they really want that feeling of being heard and being listened to. Okay, so that's a little bit about how you might listen, but a conversation involves listening, it also involves speaking. So I'll close by giving you one piece of advice about how to speak more effectively. So a good conversation involves questions, but not just any type of question. So ask questions that open up rather than foreclose conversation. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think it's easiest to illustrate that with an example. So if I'm a Democrat and I'm talking to a Republican, right, I wouldn't want to say, why won't you just admit that Donald Trump is guilty of every one of these felony counts and he belongs in prison, right? Because that'll just get people behind their kind of partisan blinders, right? And people will just sort of put up their defenses. But a better strategy might be to try and create space for conversation by saying, what's a time when Donald Trump or another leader has disappointed you and you wish they'd have done something different? And maybe you then frame that by giving an example where a leader from your own side has disappointed you, right? Notice how a sort of subtle rhetorical shift there is opening up a new space for possibility, right? And suggesting to someone, oh, they're not just going to fall into that partisan trap of always defending their own side. And that will hopefully then spur on a bit of conversation. Now, that might not always work, but at least gives you the opportunity and the space to try and create that conversation. So hopefully that's a brief introduction to some of those techniques. If it's of more interest, you can get a copy of the book from the library or stop and see me at office hours. So thanks so much.